Welcome to The Economist Next Door, a podcast where we make complex economic ideas accessible. No PhD required.
Smith sees order as coming from these rules, and they're coming from the bottom, and they're coming from people's experience of each other day to day, you see, and it's an ongoing thing. So this is the essence of freedom, the classical liberal idea of freedom.
Well, and it's very natural, too. I mean, because it's naturally connected to thinking about prices. The role of prices is emerging from the bottom up, right?
Yes.
The prices are in a market setting, also decentralized, also require freedom for people to set prices, to change prices, to not be top down. So in many ways, it really makes a lot of sense that he has this sort of moral theory, social theory, but then he also develops all these sort of economic ideas for impersonal exchange or extended exchange as well. This week, I sat down with a very special guest, Vernon Smith. Vernon won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2002 for his pioneering work in the field of experimental economics. Although experimental economics usually involves a lot of math and what we call game theory, Vernon ran remarkably clean experiments or simulations to demonstrate the effectiveness of market transactions, how supply and demand forces tend to lead to equilibrium prices, even when people don't know everything about the market, how asset trading naturally forms asset bubbles, especially when there's a lot of liquidity, and most importantly, how people learn quickly through experience and trading. Vernon is also an avid fan of Adam Smith's work and believes that Smith's moral psychology and the theory of moral sentiments grounds many of his economic ideas in the wealth of nations. I hope you're ready for a more philosophical episode with one of the great economists of the last century. Let's dive in. Well, Vernon, thank you for joining me on The Economist Next Door. It's really a privilege to sit down with you. I've read many of your papers over the years, Asset Bubbles, your Nobel lecture, of course, on rationality, which had a lot of great ideas. And of course, you've done a lot in what many people call humanomics, and this kind of bringing philosophy into economics and really rediscovering the ideas of Adam Smith in particular, who you've written about extensively. And so I thought maybe we would start there. Many people know The Wealth of Nations, even if they haven't read it. But far fewer people know about the theory of moral sentiments. And far fewer people have read the theory of moral sentiments. But you've argued and talked about the importance of Adam Smith's moral theory for understanding his economics. So could you maybe say a little bit about, how you approach Adam Smith, why maybe he's underappreciated in many circles, and how you read those two books as working together?
Sure. And well, of course, The Wealth of Nations is by far the better known book because that book is about economics. It's about policy. From the beginning, it attracted the attention of heads of state and leaders in political life. And because it deals with economic policy, and particularly the role of government in economic policy. But and that was published in 1776, and of course this year is the anniversary of that publication of that book. But in 1759, he wrote The Theory of Moral Sentiments, and there's reason to believe, in fact, that he considered the Theory of Moral Sentiments his most important work. And I think it is his most important work. And it's also a hard book to read. I once was talking with some friends about the Theory of Moral Sentiments, and they were quite interested in it. And I said, well, let me give you a copy. I've got several copies, paperback copies of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Let me just give you a copy. She brought it back about a month later, and she says, we cannot, we're lost, but we don't really understand it. And it is a hard book to understand. And in my writings, including Humanomics, jointly with Bart Wilson, but also in my own book, I call it Adam Smith's Theory of Society.
I wonder if you could comment on, a couple ideas that I think really matter for understanding human action and what economics does and what it can't do. is thinking about maybe the difference between being self-interested or acting in your self-interest versus selfishness.
Yes.
Smith has a lot to say about that.
Adam Smith distinguished between being self-interested and acting in your self-interest. To him, he saw these as distinct, whereas particularly modern utilitarians, the actions lead to consequences. The consequences have value to the people who are making decisions, so you attach utility with that. So everything is about consequences. But Adam Smith saw really there's two broad classes of rules that people follow. And he categorized them as rules of beneficence, rules of justice. Beneficence is about the good things we do for each other in our neighborhoods and communities. And then the justice is about limiting, restraining, controlling the hurtful things that we do to each other. For example, what's the most hurtful thing that anyone can do to another person? It's murder. So murder followed by theft and robbery, and also violation of contract. These are kind of three categories of hurtful things that we do. But you see, that picks up just about everything. If murder is under control, and there are penalties for that and restrictions on murder, then that gives you a right to your body and your mind. If theft and robbery are punished and are not allowed, control of those is what gives you rights to the products, you see, of your body. And the performance of promises. Contracts give us rights to each other's promises. We work out, you see, and have agreements that we each follow. So that this is really very comprehensive. And Smith points out that the penalty for theft and robbery is greater than for violation of contract. He says this is because theft and robbery take from us what we have already acquired. He says violation of contract just frustrates our expectation of gain. So Smith could see, that these big things like this in society are rooted, in our communities and neighborhoods. Well, we all have a motivation to get along with each other, and we tend to follow rules that facilitate that getting along with each other. And economics is really just these rules extended to our economic transactions.
Well, to tie it, so you helped pioneer the field of experimental economics, where you put people in various situations, they can make exchanges, they have different kinds of payoffs, which tends to be very consequence focused in the game theory of sort of, well, how do I get the best payoff? What's the optimal strategy? But going back to Smith, talking about it's not just consequences. Russ Roberts has said, one way of describing what Smith points out is that people desire not just to be loved, which is a consequence, but to be lovely, to be a certain kind of person. And so I wonder if you could comment on where you've seen that even in the experimental setting, where people don't care just about how do I get the most dollars. They do care about getting dollars or getting some kind of payoff, but there's other kinds of things that they care about when they're engaging in interactions with the people in the classroom. And so maybe you could comment on some of that internality of the motivations that people bring.
It's very easy to make decisions that hurt others. Humans are sensitive to how their actions may affect others, and they will take that into account. And you particularly see this in neighborhoods where people are constantly helping each other and doing things. There are social exchanges that go on in our neighborhoods and communities. And Smith says that actions of a beneficent tendency alone require reward because of the gratitude felt by the person who receives some good-hearted action.
Right.
And also there's a social consensus on these. Third-party observers agree with this. And Smith points out that there's sort of a debt of gratitude that only we can discharge. And the neat thing about this, you see, is that Smith sees order as coming from these rules, and they're coming from the bottom. and they're coming from people's experience of each other day to day, you see, and it's an ongoing thing. So this is the essence of freedom, the
Right.
classical liberal idea of freedom.
Well, and it's very natural too. I mean, because it's naturally connected to think about prices. The role of prices is emerging from the
Yes.
bottom up, right?
Yes.
The prices are in a market setting, also decentralized, also, require freedom for people to set prices, to change prices, to not
Yes.
be top down. So in many ways, it really makes a lot of sense that he has this sort of moral theory, social theory, but then he also develops all these sort of economic ideas for impersonal exchange or extended exchange as well.
Well, it's interesting that both Hume and Smith saw themselves as articulating a theory of society based upon what they called experimental reasoning. The idea that our theories should be able to deal with cases, examples, you see. The idea that there has to be some kind of empirical justification for these sweeping theories and principles that we follow. We have, of course, a constitution very much based on these principles. The whole idea that you are innocent until proved guilty, and your guilt will be determined by a jury of peers. You see, those ideas come directly out of this notion that we're rooted into the lives of other people.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, his whole notion of justice comes from the fact that we resent hurtful action, deliberately hurtful actions by others toward us. We resent that, and we want to punish it. We tend to lash out. And he points out that this is such a powerful thing that if you bump your knee on a stone, you may unthinkingly strike the stone.
Mm-hmm.
He uses that as an example to kind of show how really automatic and almost unthinking it is. It's a powerful piece of literature that, I tell people my books are really designed to stimulate your interest in material moral sentiments.
Right.
If you're willing right now to go and read it, do it. Don't read me.
Right.
But my experience is a lot of people have trouble reading it.
It might be easier to start with you.
Yes.
Well, and again, it gets back to this consequences versus motivation, and when Smith talks about this example of people intending to harm us versus accidents. You
Yes.
might have someone who attempts to trip you and fails, and you'll still be angry with them for trying to trip you on purpose, versus someone might actually trip you by accident. But once you realize it was accidental, you don't blame them for it. You move on. And so it's not just were you tripped or not, but this actual relationship.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about like local communities and these interactions and these informal rules, which are important. I think part of what economists try to do is try to explain the emergent order in society. One of the lines that Hayek wrote that sticks with me is he talks about how people have this desire to smash what they don't understand, right? They don't understand why is this person a millionaire or a billionaire, or why is this happening? And so how do we see this sort of emergent order in the economy? Then how do prices and property play a role?
Yes. Well, see, people early got together. They had fairs, celebrations. The Native Americans had potlatches, and they had various kinds of people loved to get together for merriment and music, dancing, all of this sort of thing. Well, this was also a tremendous time for the trade between people who don't normally know each other. And the social setup and those circumstances are such that there's some discipline of the exchange that's going on, so that if somebody cheated someone, there's a kind of a community response to that, because everyone feels sympathy for a victim.
Right.
That's a central thing you see in what Smith is talking about. And because we can all relate to someone who's the victim of an unfair practice, of a hurtful action that was not justified by someone. so that there is a community support for these kinds of developments. But trade, you see, he had the insight to realize that if people are trading with others, they're motivated to specialize. Why should I produce everything that I need? I can get what I need by specializing in one thing and then exchanging with others to get all my other wants satisfied. And no one had to design this
Right.
or see it or understand it for it to happen, you see.
Yeah.
And he points out that by the time philosophers come along and are thinking about the origins, the meaning in the lives that people live, but that they're coming along, they then see these propositions and see these truths, but people don't have to wait on the philosophers
Right.
or theorists, you see, it's a source of order that is not only powerful, but not easily displaced and returns. And it's likely to come back in, you see, after disruptions.
Well, I'm reminded of, as you're probably familiar with the Adam Ferguson quote, right? The idea that much of what we see in the world is the result of human action, but not necessarily of human design, right?
Yes,
That these things emerge where people are pursuing their various goals, and you have, you look out on a busy city square, and all the individual people are going in their different directions and so forth, and nobody is directing the traffic, but people are getting to where they're going and not run into each other. So I used to teach in New York City, and I would tell my students, okay, let's go over to the Oculus, this big train station they built by the World Trade Center. You go up on the balcony and you watch, and hundreds of people during a busy time are walking, and none of them run into each other.
Yeah.
It's remarkable because they're mutually adjusting to one another, but there's no one directing traffic. There's these norms about where do you stand on the escalator or do you walk up it. So all these things form in ways that people feel like they have to plan or have to control, but actually these things can emerge just through good rules.
Yes.
And responses, prices, and the people adjusting to one another's behavior over time. So my question for you, you talked about freedom being a part, like a fundamental part of classical liberalism and the society, these social orders. You've done a lot of work on the importance of information, or even how you don't necessarily need as much information as economists might think to arrive at optimal trading outcomes or optimal situations. So reflecting on that, what would you say, or how ought we to think about the role of government either in planning? So there's a lot of conversation about planning different industries. We need more semiconductors, we need more rare earth metals, whatever it might be, or we need to regulate AI. So what kind of concerns should we have about bureaucrats or politicians trying to direct the way industries develop or the way different kinds of companies are regulated, given this information is necessary or not?
Well, I think the proper role of government is to simply facilitate the kinds of orderly processes that emerge from neighborhoods and communities.
Mm-hmm.
And as communities got much larger, there was a sense that there needed to be some sort of somewhat more central responsibility for the order that was going on. In fact, in the lectures on jurisprudence, he talks about early governments being weak and decentralized, and the authorities in those communities were very anxious to follow the norms and rules that the families had traditionally followed.
Mm-hmm.
So the magistrate or the government, the people who work for government, Smith saw that their primary function was to facilitate those and continue those.
Mm-hmm.
For example, he said that in these early governments, if your son murdered mine, and the authorities were able to apprehend your son, he would be brought to me as head of the family that was the victim, and to decide what's to be done. And the son that committed the murder might not be put down And in fact, a deal might very well be worked out for a transfer of land, of resources, of money to the family and friends of the victim. So you had this idea that the punishment of the wrongdoer involved compensation of the victim.
Right.
Well, he says in modern society we've lost that, but early governments went through a stage where they were very close. The punishment was very much worked out with the consent and understanding of the victim family and friends. And the state came along and they saw that they could facilitate by being in charge of these transfers that would take place. And even had a name, a vingeld. The vingeld was the payment or the transfer of things of value to the victim's family in compensation for that victim. So the capital punishment was not always followed. It was sometimes followed. Sometimes the victims would be so outraged they thought that the comparable punishment is the death of the person who caused the death of my son.
Right.
You see, but it might very well other things would be involved rather than that as a substitute for that. But it's interesting that we sort of lost that. You see, the notion that the responsibility of the apprehended criminal is to make whole the victim as much as possible. And even though, there's no way to compensate for the loss of the life of a son, there's nevertheless ways to make life more comfortable for these friends. And so, of course, there are people that argue that today, that there are movements and everything, but still, basically, crime is responded to with a vector of punishments for different crimes, and that tends to deter, but it does nothing to help restore the victim. So I think that's really, and so you can see where Smith's ideas of government and the limited role of government and the proper role of government come from by looking at the history of, when he talks about the history of jurisprudence.
Right. Exactly. It reminds me, with my kids too, of sometimes when they misbehave, you punish them, but sometimes it's sort of, okay, you hit your sister or took something from her. Now you need to go read her a story. Right.
Yes.
Yes. Now you need to go do something, to both to make restitution and also to restore a kind of relationship there. When you're talking, it reminds me a lot of the work of Jane Jacobs and Eleanor Ostrom and the nature of neighborhoods and communities. And Eleanor Ostrom, one of the things that really stood out to me about her work is, one of the things she studied was consolidation of government in large cities. So you look at like New York City, for example, and it used to have the boroughs had their own education system, their own police departments, their own fire departments. And then I don't remember if it was in the 60s or the 70s, but there was this move for consolidation where it said, well, we're duplicating all of this back office work, or so we will be more efficient, which, as you know, is kind of a loaded term, you can take economics. But if we centralize and consolidate and have one school district or one police department for all 5 boroughs, we're going to save all these efficiencies. And what Ostrom points out, I think in part related to what you're talking about, is, well, that may or may not be true on some margin, but you're losing the local self-governance. And
yes,
reflecting on this, it makes me think also about the idea of crowding out, that as we have more of a, police and judicial system that enforces certain kinds of behavior or tries to enforce whatever the laws are, you lose a lot of the informal pushback or discipline, right? Where I had a neighbor who was really difficult and people would call the police. But 100 years ago, 80 years ago, a bunch of us on the street would have gotten together and walked over and say, you really need to stop annoying everybody. It's causing problems, or like, we might rough you up a little bit. But that's like not really allowed in our kind of hyper centralized sort of world. So I wonder if you could reflect on, there is this desire for efficiency in government or centralization of government, but I think we lose many of the things you're talking about as we build these maybe bureaucratic kind of systems for dealing with criminal justice or the school system.
Yes, and you really don't want to separate it too far from people's ground level experience. So I think
Exactly.
that's the main lesson that I got out of Adam Smith, and well, my interest though, I got to Adam Smith through Hayek primarily
Yeah.
because Hayek had in the fatal conceit, he's got a great summary of it. He says, rules alone can ignite a spontaneous order. Neither all ends pursued nor all means used need be known by anybody,
Right.
but are discovered in the process, you see, of interacting and producing the outcome. And that's a great insight, but it's in Adam Smith.
Right. Well, and it's connected to what you're talking about with
Yeah.
jurisprudence, right? So part of the debate over jurisprudence is, do we discover laws, like kind of a natural law, like a whole natural law system, and common law is we discover what the laws ought to be, either through cases over time or just through, learning about nature and human society, versus a more top-down, we're just going to make laws to kind of design society the way we want to. And very different. I mean, this is going back in our conversation, but I think many people don't realize how different Adam Smith and David Hume and the Scottish Enlightenment was from, say, the French Enlightenment, which was very radical in its nature and wanted to sort of tear things down, have everything be according to reason and order. And the Scots really appreciate tradition and nature as having knowledge and helping us to discover rules that actually work, that are actually, fit our sympathy and our sentiments.
Well, and you see the importance of freedom in all of this, because it's freedom to explore that is part of the input, you see, to new rules and the discovery of rules that will be better for new circumstances and new challenges that come up. You asked what about modern economic theory? Well, a lot of it came from the 1870s, the marginal revolution, the kind of the discovery that cost, production, utility, these could be modeled mathematically. And so we could provide the kind of the core of economic theory, express it mathematically.
So as we kind of wrap here a little bit, I'm curious, what would you, from, again, all of your experience in writing, what are a couple things that people would be helped to keep in mind and remember about, again, society and the economy and how we transact and exchange with one another?
Let me put it this way. You learn the most from finding yourself wrong.
Okay.
I realized I was kind of spectacularly wrong 3 times in my career. And each of these were the source of my major source of learning that kind of created who I was. And the first time I was wrong was when I did a market experiment in a classroom. And the reason why I did the experiment was because I went to Purdue. I finished at Harvard in 1955, went to Purdue in the fall of 55, and I was teaching principles of economics. And I realized that something that I didn't understand or know anything about. And that's the connection between the supply and demand theory that we were teaching and kind of what real people do on the ground. You see, how does that, the supply and demand theory, connect up with that? And now I had been exposed to Chamberlain at Harvard. He taught the course Monopolistic Competition. And I didn't take the course because I'd been at the University of Kansas and I had a really good course, Imperfect Monopolistic Competition and Imperfect Markets. And so I didn't feel I needed to, but I did sit in on the first couple of, and in fact, most of the classes being offered, I sat in the first, which Harvard students typically do, graduate students decide what to take because, again, there the program, you don't have to take all the classes. So I sat in this class the first couple of days, and Chamberlain did a little experiment. Was the first day of the class to kind of set the stage for his course in monopolistic competition. And he took half the class and gave them values, and the other half they were buyers. The other half he gave them costs; they were sellers, and they were to think of themselves as making money, profit equal to, if they were a buyer, the difference between the price at which they purchased and the value. So they would tend to buy low, and the sellers would profit by selling by the difference between the price at which they sold to some buyer and their costs. But he had everybody just circulate and make bilateral deals.
Yep.
So a buyer and a person who had a value would meet a person with a cost, and that's the buyer and the seller. Well, if the cost was above the value, no deal was possible. Yep. They would soon find that out, and then they would repair. So it was what we later called a random meetings economy. Okay. And as people made contracts, deals, he had them bring their value and their cost up and tell them what price that they had agreed on. And each person was a buyer or seller of a single unit. So it was all very simple. Well, and then he would plot those. Well, commonly they didn't show any tendency toward the equilibrium. They would be very commonly below, although some would also be above. So he said, this is a competitive market. So I thought, well, wait a minute, suppose I take Chamberlain's setup and I'll find out how they traded in the New York Stock Exchange and the commodity markets in Chicago and have an open exchange based on that. So there's an old book by Leffler called The Stock Market, and it has it has a lot in it about the rules, okay, in these different markets. So I from that book, I got the oral outcry two-sided auction, where buyers, any buyer was free to announce a bid, any seller an ask. A new bid had to be higher, a new ask had to be lower. A contract can come from a buyer accepting an ask or a seller accepting a bid. So I thought, okay, I'm going to implement those rules. And I had 22 people in my sophomore class in January, the following semester, in January 1956. So there were 22 people. I made 11 buyers, 11 sellers, and I gave them values, which 11 buyers formed the value. That was the demand schedule. Yep. And then here's these 11 sellers. I give them costs, and that's the supply schedule. So I knew that. Each person only knew his little fragment of the total, his value as a buyer or his cost as a seller. And so I described the oral outcry auction, which, by the way, it's amazing how they just pick. It's just natural. We're humans. It's easy to do. Easy to do. And so they started bids, asks. Then there'd be an acceptance, a trade. Well, for one thing, the range is rapidly narrowed right at the beginning. Because people are buyers are trying to get absurdly low prices, sellers high price. They can't, and there's no takers, so they concede. They come together. So when we have the first trade, it's not that far from the equilibrium. And the next one was a little closer, and then I'd repeat it. They would trade out. I said, okay, that's Monday. Now we're going to open for a new trading day. You've all come to market with a refreshed demand and supply. And so when we have a second period and a third period, well, those contracts tended to start not all that far from the equilibrium and then get closer, converge. Well, I found that it contradicted everything we thought we believed, everything we thought we knew. We thought that, and William Stanley Jevons was the English author who had kind of most influenced at least the theory, you see. And it was thought that you had to have that without completing a market to reach an equilibrium really needed complete information. It means that all buyers and sellers would have to know the entire supply and demand. Well, so I not only found that hard to believe based upon all of our understanding and trading, because we thought complete information was necessary. We also thought you had to have a large number of buyers and sellers, so that there was no one that had any very important influence on the price. These are the things we believed. Later, I did this experiment and converged. I thought it was an accident of the symmetry. I had a completely symmetry, so the average value was equal to the average cost, was equal to the price. I said so I started to do variations on it that were not symmetric. They all converged, and more they do it in about 3 or 4 periods.
Right.
They all tend. So these ideas, I was completely disabused of my thinking about markets, and I thought this is the real market. What are these people doing here? I had a learning tool, you see.
Right.
And I went on and I did variations. I said, I'm going to try the case where people have complete information. That slowed convergence. It not only was not necessary, it wasn't even sufficient.
Yeah.
You see, because people could, and it was very clear if you did the experiment, people could identify better things to do than to go to wherever the group seemed to be gravitating. And they resisted it. But the point is, the resistance was not effective.
Right.
It still converged. And so all of that, I realized, you see, at some point that being wrong about markets turned out to be a really important part of my learning about markets, because I had a way of studying markets, and and we looked at different institutions of trading instead of the open outcry. Let's just let sellers post prices, take it or leave it, like in ordinary retail markets. There it is. It's posted, take it or leave it. Well, the problem is the sellers get the wrong prices and they have to adjust, and they tend to be too high. They come down. Also, that has an interesting effect, because if sellers start high and then can't make trades and then cut prices and find that now they can make trades, buyers game that. You open a new period and they sit there and the prices, the quotes up and they're coming down. They just let them come down because they're coming down
until everybody starts
jumping. Then finally they'll grab them.
Yeah.
And so it just ended up being an incredible learning device for me. And then, of course, I gave talks, started to publish in 1962 my first paper, and the JPE accepted it. And moreover, that paper, I had first submitted it to the American Economic Review, and they turned it down. And the comments, I was just outraged by the comments. The referees didn't really have an understanding of what the hell was going on.
Right.
Well, you see, all of this was just new. Here's this guy doing this stuff in the laboratory. Well, economics is not a laboratory science, you see. Why they were asking, why are you doing this? Read what I wrote, and you'll find out why.
It reminds me of the joke that economists want to know if what works in practice works in theory.
Yes,
right?
yeah.
You know, and I think this is a great point to end on, you know, with your reflection here of being wrong and learning from that, really kicking off your career in so many ways.
Yeah.
And that's really the power of markets, right? The
Yeah.
whole idea of markets is that people learn, right? And part of why freedom matters and why experimentation matters and why prices and sort of decentralization matters is so that people can go out and try things and learn, oh, that worked really well and I should do more of it. Or
Yeah.
that worked really badly. I should stop doing that. And this is what profit and loss are about. This is social exchange as well. I tried to help my neighbor and they really didn't like my casserole. So maybe I shouldn't make them casserole anymore, you know? And so I think part of what's underappreciated often, we think about markets is like creating wealth, which they do, efficiency, which there is elements of efficiency, but really markets are learning mechanisms, right?
Exactly.
This is how we
Yes.
can improve and,
Yeah.
and both how we relate to others and what we do.
Yes. And we are very much interdependent with others in markets. And we learn from others. And you see, and then when I eventually started to read the theory of moral sentiments and understand what he was talking about, I thought, oh my gosh, how in the world did this guy in 1759 have all of this? And in The Wealth of Nations, if you read chapter 7, which is really, Smith is describing how buyers and sellers discover prices in the market. And he's thinking about how they are finding the prices. He's not imagining how one might optimally. He's really
People actually doing.
he really is interested in the agents of economic action and modeling the agents of economic action in their circumstances based upon his observation of what they do and how they and it's just it's incredible.
There's kind of the original experimental economist in a way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Vernon, thank you so much for sitting down with me and joining me. This was great. So thank you.